This week on the BackTable podcast.
Dr. Haessler said you got to fail early and you got to fail sometimes often to really develop a good product or a good idea. And on the path of innovation, there's always going to be failures. Without failure, there's just no progress. I think personally as failure as bricks that we use to pave a path. If you fail enough, you will collect enough bricks to pave the path to ultimate success. And that's really what it's all about. And I really would encourage all of our colleagues to go out there. You see problems every day in your practices. These challenges that we all see in healthcare are not really roadblocks. There are invitations to innovate and to improve. And we can make a much bigger difference, I think, in patients' lives when we embrace that concept.
Welcome to the BackTable podcast, your source for all things urology. You can find all previous episodes of our podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and at backtable.com. Hello and welcome once again to BackTable Urology Podcast, your educational source for all things urology and then some. I'm your host today, Dr. Suzette Sutherland, and I'm very excited to have a wonderful panel of innovators in urology as our guests for this special episode entitled just that, Innovation in Urology. So we have with us today 3 surgeons who have all invented something and then have seen it through developmental processes, and they're each at different stages of their career and the product development. So I thought it would be interesting to hear their journeys, how they came up with their ideas, and how they actualized their innovation and their concepts. So with us today, first we have Dr. Tova Weiss. She is a urology resident at the University of Washington in Seattle, and she developed an interesting urinary catheter product that improves catheter safety. She did this during her residency. She's still in her residency, and she continues to see it through the developmental stages, so to speak. So good morning, Dr. Weiss.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Next, we have Dr. Shakuri-Rad. He's a practicing urologist in Morgantown, West Virginia. He trained at the University of Michigan. His practice now emphasizes on robotics, but he also has a lot of experience in the world of neuromodulation, dealing with various pelvic floor issues. And he developed something called the Foramen Finder, which we're going to hear more about. Good morning, Dr. Shakuri-Rad.
Good morning, and thanks for having me.
And our third guest is Dr. Allie Haessler, a practicing urogynecologist in Northern California in the San Francisco Bay Area, who developed a novel vaginal ring that provides vaginal stimulation designed to provide neuromodulation therapy, again, for pelvic floor issues such as overactive bladder. So good morning, Dr. Haessler.
Hi. Happy to be here.
So I want to give each of you, of course, the opportunity to further describe your products, and then we'll get into some of the practical components of your journeys that helped them to actually be successful. So we'll start with you, Dr. Weiss, again, a resident at the University of Washington, PGY 5, I believe at this point. Am I correct?
PGY 4.
Oh, PGY 4. I get so mixed up. The years fly by fast. So PGY 4. Well, tell us, first of all, a little bit about your product, and then we'll get into your journey.
Yeah, so when I was a resident, I was getting consulted frequently for patients who were altered or delirious and pulling out their urinary catheters. It was leading to the balloon ripping through the prostatic urethra and tissue trauma. And so our current solutions were patient restraints and one-to-one sitters, and these felt like subpar solutions. And so I wanted to create a device that actually solved this problem. So I worked with a group of medical engineers to develop an accessory to a standard Foley catheter. It allows the distal end of the catheter to disconnect when it gets pulled, but the balloon remains inflated so it can be reconnected for continued use. And it's hoping to solve this problem of tissue trauma.
And really, if you think about it, it's sort of relatively simple from thinking about it standpoint, but then the development of it and the design of it is not so simple. So tell us a little bit more about working with the engineers at the University of Washington and what your contribution to that was.
Yeah, so I'm not an engineer myself. I don't have any engineering background. So I definitely need the partnership with the engineers. I pitched the unmet need, and they kind of took it from there. It was part of their senior capstone project. So they worked with a group of engineering faculty to develop the prototype. And one of the most difficult parts about our device was making sure that we could keep the balloon inflated. It was something I hadn't even thought about when I came up with the problem. And then throughout our development, they didn't have any medical background, and so they would reach out to me for the medical perspective. And it was kind of an ongoing partnership. We spoke frequently and worked together to kind of combine our skill sets. So it was a senior capstone project, and when they graduated, we'd gained enough traction and gotten some funding for it to continue. And one of the engineers decided to work full time. And the rest of us, it's four engineers, are working part time.
So I am familiar with, obviously, the urology program at the University of Washington. PGY4 is usually a research year. For most of them, it's a dedicated research year. So that's where you are right now. But it seems like a large undertaking for a resident to do something like this in 1 year's time. When did the idea start, and when did you start making connections with other people to collaborate within the University of Washington?
Yeah, so I started as a PGY2, actually, when I first pitched the idea. My participation was less in the beginning, as they were first just working on developing a prototype, and they would meet with me about once a week. And then I am actually on the clinical track, so not doing a research year. But in my research time, I was working on it full time, and now I work about 10 hours a week. So for a normal job, 40 hours plus 10 is not too demanding. But when you consider a resident's work schedule, I work about 80 hours a week in residency, and then I tack about 10 hours a week onto Cath Connect work. It's been definitely demanding, but I've had a huge amount of support both from the urology faculty that have been available for basically consultation with anything research related, and then the engineering school has been hugely helpful.
Great. And you also mentioned you, or else the engineering students, I understand, right? If they were doing a capstone project, there was also engineering students involved, were able to acquire a grant. And so is that what predominantly funded this?
Yeah, so our first funding was from grant competitions when they were students. And then after they graduated, we've gotten a couple of grants, both through the University of Washington and locally and national grants. So we've gotten non-dilutive grant funding, and then we're in the middle of our first seed of fundraising, both from private investors and family and friends rounds.
Wow, wonderful. So what are the next steps for you?
So we have filed our patent through University of Washington, and our next steps are currently our device is 3D printed, and so we want to move to injection molding. And so we're working with a product development firm to move to injection molding, and then we've just started the regulatory process to go through the FDA process.
So does that mean, though, that the product is done being developed? You're just trying to figure out how to produce it when you talk about the 3D and...
We have a functional prototype. We're going to have to make some changes when we go from 3D printing to injection molding, just based on the requirements for development. So we have what our user needs, and then we're going to be working with the product development firm to move our 3D printed prototype into injection molding.
Okay, wonderful. Well, that's great. That really shows, I think what the power of innovation as a urology resident can do, right? With the appropriate funding, skills, support, collaboration. Being at a very large, I think, research institute was most likely of benefit as well. It's being able to align yourself with other people with a similar idea. So it's wonderful. Congratulations to you for all the work you've done in this area.
Thank you so much. Yeah, we definitely could not have done it without the expertise of many people, both in the urology department, engineering department, and University of Washington as a whole.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, let's move on to Dr. J. Shakuri-Rad. Again, a practicing urologist now in Morgantown, West Virginia, who developed what he calls the Foramen Finder. So I'm not going to steal your thunder. Just tell us about it.
Yeah, so I'm excited to share insights into our tool to enhance the installation process of P&E leads through a navigational method. Now, sacral neuromodulation has been around for a long time, going way back to the 70s when Nishold and Friedman tried to stimulate bladder control, and it moved on to the 80s when Tanago and Schmidt tried to place a permanent implant. And further work was done by Dr. Siegel in the early 90s when he developed a stage technique, and Medtronic and InterStim system came about and really set the stage for today's S&M approaches. Now, during this entire process, there was a lot of innovation that was going on. And this innovation came sort of to a halt once Medtronic had developed this tool. We had the procedure available. And because of the monopoly in this space, there was some innovation that essentially started lagging behind. And it was in the early 2010s, I think it was 2013, when Axonics entered the scene, and they tried to develop this MRI-safe rechargeable battery for S&M that got FDA approved in 2019. And that really started sparking interest in the space again. There was now competition. Competition is healthy and really ignites innovation. And I was trained by one of the descendants of Dr. Steve Siegel, Jana Thompson, and I actually saw Dr. Siegel at the conference here recently, and I joked with him that if Jana is his daughter, then I would be his grandson. And so early in my training, I realized that there was a simple act and rate-limiting step of the S&M procedure, and this was to get a foramen needle into the right opening at the right angle and depth. And it was crazy to me how long that step took, even for advanced users. Some were using live fluoroscopy in the clinic or at the ASCs, but most didn't have access to live fluoroscopy, and so they were using the blind technique. And patients come in different shapes and sizes, and unfortunately, their anatomy rarely mimics the good old butt model we all use to train ourselves, our residents and fellows. And so it was a little bit difficult to train people to really efficiently place this needle in the right place. And so I worked with Dr. Thompson on an ultrasound technique. We published on this, and unfortunately, the learning curve was so steep, it never really took off. So fast forward a few years, now I'm an attending in Morgantown, West Virginia, and one day I invited one of my friends who is a plastic surgeon to my office, and him and I actually started a development studio, a device studio, medtech device studio, and our goal was to really ignite innovation in medicine locally and try to help physicians and other healthcare professionals to develop products. And when I brought him to my office, I said, hey, why don't you watch this procedure I do? There is a problem with it. I think I have a solution. I want you to give me your insight. And when he saw me do the blind technique, he pulled me aside and he said, Jay, why in the world would you blindly stick a needle in someone's back and try to hit a tiny target in the spine? This is miserable. And I agreed with him, and I said, it's time for maybe us to look at a navigational method. And navigational methods have been around now at different surgical areas, whether it's spine, where Mazo Robotics uses a navigational method to place screws in the spine, or orthopedic space, and certainly the robotic space in general. And I worked with our engineers. We also have some fabulous engineers, software, hardware engineers, and we sat down and developed a product that would allow us to take a simple X-ray of a patient's back, and using that X-ray, we would mark a few spots on the X-ray, the coccyx, the S3 foramen, the skin, and we would say, okay, what would be the ideal angle to put a needle in? The software then that we developed would tell us coordinates, 3 coordinates. One of the coordinates is the distance from the coccyx to the entry point. Another one is the depth of the needle, and the third one is the angle at which the needle should be deployed. We combine that with a hardware tool, and this is what we call the T-square when we developed it, but it simply almost looks like a ruler that goes from the coccyx up to the skin, and it has a small introducer in it that allows us to put the needle inside the coordinate that the software tells us, and then you simply just push down on the needle, and if everything goes well, you go straight into S3 at the perfect angle and the perfect depth. And so we developed the IRB around this and started using it for our patients, and we saw that this is really working well. We were actually surprised. I was surprised how well it was working. And so we started inviting some partners from industry to come and take a look at it, and that's really what ignited the rest of the story.
Let me ask you, so you described doing it for the P&E, for the people in the audience that do neuromodulation, and that's just the placement of those testing wires. Can this procedure or this device also be used for implantation of the actual lead?
It absolutely can. And the IRB that we developed was simply just for the office P&E, the blind P&E. But now it's actually being tested for both, and the FDA approval for it is going to be for both as well.
Wonderful. Okay. So for those people, again, in the audience who do neuromodulation, we know that the rate-limiting step really is how well that lead gets placed, right? And I certainly talk to patients myself about that. So if we see that they responded well to their trial, the onus is on me to get the lead in a good place in order to get them the best result that they can get. And so this really is going to really move the needle here as far as how well people can place that lead. So it's really wonderful, and hopefully open up this therapy to even more people and more providers who are a little leery of trying it because they might sense the difficulty of it, and makes it a little bit easier and more reliable. So that's wonderful.
Thank you.
I assume that you have a patent for this. Is that correct?
For us, yeah, we submitted a couple of patents and continue to improve the patent as well. And the patent process, for those who don't know, once you submit a provisional patent, which kind of buys you time, gives you about a year to finalize a patent, and you can continuously evolve the idea or the product. And so we have had several modifications, and all of it has now been approved.
And so you have successfully sold this company, invested in Neuromodulation, who I think plan to move forward with it with further development if that's needed, then on to marketing, and so on and so forth. What was the decision for you to where you were in your own process that it was time to sell it versus continuing to develop it on your own?
So through our innovations lab, we had actually done this and gone through this process a few times with other products, not urology related. And so we were familiar with the different options available to us, whether we would do an early exit and just sell the product to another company that can further develop it, or stand up our own company. We do have actually CEOs in-house that we assigned ideas to. And when we looked at this, we first wanted to certainly partner up with those in industry that are already very familiar with sacral neuromodulation. Our product certainly is not really worth anything without the actual sacral modulation devices on the market. This is a way to improve the other company's product. So we invited the companies to our office. They actually looked at this, vetted the product, and the first company, Medtronic, was very comfortable with the product. They were excited. They understood the problem because they had been in the space for over 20 years. And then we had also the new company that was Axonics come to the office and do the same. And they also understood the shortcomings of the P&E procedure. And so they also were very interested. And when we decided to go to the next step, we said, why don't we do a collaboration agreement with one or both companies? Because maybe we can take this to a next level and make it even better using both partnerships. And what we found is that when you look at industry partners, you have to really understand their business model. You really have to understand the scope of their practice. If you look at a big company like Medtronic, for example, that has a plethora of products in cardiac space, in neurosurgical space, urology certainly, and so forth, their attention to the sacral neuromodulation space was not really that great at the time. And then we had Axonics, whose only product was sacral neuromodulation. They didn't have anything else to distract them. And so they really were more interested in this concept that we had. So the first step, I think, is always you have to find the right partner and stay true to your mission. If your mission is to improve procedure, then you need to really leave the money side of things out of the equation and say, who can help me get to the point that this can really make a difference for patients? And that was our goal, and that's how we talked to these companies. And ultimately, we selected a partner we thought would really help us develop this product further, and that partner was Axonics in this case.
So you mentioned a collaborative agreement. So what does that really mean? And does that mean that you are able to stay involved in the further development of this or investing in it? Or have you actually just sold it to Axonics? And if you have, what kind of agreement has happened? Whatever you're allowed to tell us anyway. Where are your rights in the process? What have you relinquished and what do you still have?
Sure. So in the process of deciding on that collaboration model that we presented, Axonics was really interested in just taking this idea and taking it to the next level themselves because they understood the importance of it. And so they gave us really two options. They said there's a collaboration agreement we are okay with that. You guys can continue working on it. We provide some funding. And then there was an outright purchase of the product and the idea at an early stage. And after really kicking this around with our colleagues, that we decided that for this specific product, the best option was an early exit, because again, it relied on another company's overall product line. So the Foramen Finder by itself is not really doing anything. It needs a sacral neuromodulation unit. And Axonics seemed like they were not interested in shelving this product. They definitely wanted to continue with the development of it and putting it in the hands of physicians and ultimately benefit patients. And so we decided on an early exit. So Axonics acquired the entire portfolio that we developed.
Wonderful. So does that mean you don't have any rights to it any longer yourself personally, or are you still able to consult with them and advise them?
No, the rights are completely transferred to the company, and certainly they're very gracious and ask for my opinion, and want me to be involved to some degree. And we have had a very great relationship since then, and that really makes me as the inventor very happy, because I know for a fact that these guys are not just shelving the product, they're really trying to get it out there and benefit patients.
Yeah. So I wanted to touch on that just really quickly, is that you've used that term twice now, shelving the product, right? I know I have been involved in some exercises with industry or been part of different trials, and somebody came along and swept it up and bought it, but they really bought it because they didn't want it to be a source of competition for their own product, right? And so whoever was selling it made a lot of money selling it, but unfortunately that technology now is not available because it is shelved, so to speak, right? So in this case, it's great that you were able to collaborate with a company that's not interested in just shelving it, but seeing it through. So we look forward to seeing where this goes and when it'll be available for us to use in the future. So great.
Thank you.
Okay, and our third guest is Dr. Allie Haessler, again, a urogynecologist in the Bay Area, who also developed a product for neuromodulation and developed a ring that sits in the vagina, causing some stimulation to help deliver that stimulatory action that delivers the stimulation through the vagina. And again, utilizing it for the same indication, starting with OAB, but hopefully as we see this down the road, that we'll be able to increase indications just like all our neuromodulation. So welcome, Dr. Haessler, and please tell us a little bit more about how did you come up with this idea, and what were the unmet needs that you saw in the area of neuromodulation, and why a vaginal ring?
Well, I think I would not have come up with this idea if I hadn't really appreciated neurophysiology so much in med school and even undergrad. I just thought that just the simple electrical phenomena it was so simple yet so powerful. How these nerves all interact together and cascade, we don't totally understand, but they're driven by electricity, and that's very clear. I come at this from the perspective of an OBGYN, which is why I think I invented this instead of a urologist. When I was an OBGYN resident at UCLA, it was a very GYN oncology heavy program. So we did tons of radical surgery for cancer, and patients would just go home routinely with catheters for 1 to 2 weeks, just understanding they wouldn't be able to feel either their full bladder, they wouldn't be able to coordinate micturition due to the inferior hypogastric plexus and other associated nerves that were damaged or removed as part of, say, radical hysterectomy for cervical cancer treatment. And that was just part of the GYN oncology rotation. And there was some talk about nerve-sparing hysterectomy and some indications, but for GYN oncology, it wasn't so easy. These patients might be irradiated anyway. So that was just sort of in my background. Then when I went to a urogynecology fellowship, we're very focused on the nerves. They're right on the other side of the vaginal wall. We inject them regularly for procedures in the office. They're very close. And when I was a fellow, I worked at UCLA, Harbor UCLA, which was a big county program. 1 year, I rotated at 3 different hospitals in 1 year-long cycle. One of them was a private hospital where Ronald Reagan used to go. One of them was a big Kaiser with every kind of person from every background, from all kinds of socioeconomic backgrounds. And then one was a county hospital, mostly Spanish-speaking patients. And so I'd go like on a Monday to the private hospital, and then I'd go on a Tuesday to the Kaiser where InterStim was used on a regular basis, how beautifully it worked. And then I'd go to my county hospital rotation, and basically we just had Detrol and Ditropan And, if fixing your prolapse didn't help you, we said, do some Kegels and stop coffee and hope it does the trick, right? We couldn't offer neuromodulation to them. And that was sort of frustrating. But it always struck me those nerves were available. They were a beautiful target. And when I would pop in a pessary for someone, it would alleviate their prolapse and they were happy. And there was no simple treatment for these patients. And I just thought someday somebody will come up with it. And I went on with my life, came to San Francisco, started a solo practice, had kids, just didn't think about it. But it did get sort of frustrating even in private practice a few years in that there still weren't great treatments for overactive bladder. The medicines weren't great. And although InterStim was available as a sacral neuromodulation treatment that we've kind of been talking about, it wasn't either that accessible or patients didn't necessarily want it. Around here, people are very natural focused. iPhones hadn't necessarily been taken, they weren't what they are now in terms of being in people's lives with computers and things. It wasn't something people really wanted to do unless they really had to. So I just realized that there were so many women living with mild to moderate overactive bladder that chose to just live with their problem than use the treatments because the treatments were more onerous or embarrassing or intrusive than overactive bladder. But then I recognized one day that, looking at my iPhone, that what it could do, and I just said, this tiny thing can do all these things. There's no way that we can't at this stage develop a ring or some therapy that would treat and target the nerves around the cervix that coordinate micturition and continence. And so I started my path to, try to understand how to do that as someone who was just a clinician.
Yeah. So I've known Allie for a number of years, and I guess we just met when you had just gotten your patent of this.
The day.
Yeah, at a conference, and it was that day that you learned that you had received your patent, and we met, and you told me all about it. And yeah, I've been lucky enough to be part of some of the feasibility trials that have happened since then. And so, but what I was really inspired by is a little bit what you alluded to, the different types of environments in which you trained, right? And what was accessible to those patients due to their environment. And I've done some work in global health over in Africa, and same idea. Like, we know this neuromodulation works, but how can we put it in a form that's deliverable to those who aren't in an environment to be able to support sacral nerve stimulation? And that's where some of this idea arose for you, getting neuromodulation to the masses, right, in a simple way. So that was really what excited me about this. So you did get your patent, and for you, can you describe that a little bit? I mean, I think to get a patent on a therapy like this, that's neuromodulation, there are lots of other types of neuromodulation. How are you able to sort of control through your patent that somebody else doesn't come along and develop a Me Too device and beat you to the punch?
Right. So, I didn't know anything about this, but it's the Bay Area. So I have a personal contact who has a venture capital background, not for big companies, but startup. And the startup mentality is very different than a venture capital mentality. And so the startup mentality was one step at a time, try to fail, like push through a stage that seems hard, and you're going to fail early. So the first thing was explore the patent space. And we have found a lawyer that you pay as a consultant X dollars an hour instead of going to a firm. You pick somebody who's bought into your idea, who's excited, who wants you to win, who is also an engineer as well as a lawyer. And you just look at the space. And it was clear that what I was exactly trying to do was nowhere patented. But I didn't know enough to know where the lines were, right? So the patent lawyer just would, ask these kind of binary questions and get to his opinion about whether this was still a wide open space, and ultimately it was. So you need patents for two reasons. You need to know the patent space for two reasons. One is you need to protect your idea before you take any next step with money or time. You also need to know if you have what they call freedom to operate. So someone else might have a patent and it may not be exactly what you're doing, but if anybody could argue it and you're developing a product, you're liable for intruding on their patent or infringing their patent, right? So it's kind of for two purposes. But it was very wide open, and so we were granted the patents in 5 years. We used, we just named the plexuses we wanted to target. We secured the ring form factor by not allowing any other device that's more than 270 degrees in diameter, around. We picked a zone in the vagina that we are the only people, I believe, that are able to stimulate in these places. So pretty simple, broad claims on the first patent. Then we have others with other kind of layering ideas as well.
And then the next step, so you already mentioned you are part of a startup organization, right? Or started your own startup for this. So to try and see if you can totally see this through, the next steps were to try and do some studies to show that, okay, there's some feasibility to this, right? We call them feasibility trials. Now embarking on a trial just to look at how easily can women wear this. And then you're also embarking on the true FDA approval trial, which is looking at efficacy and safety. So that's been quite a journey to get through all of those steps where we're embarking on the FDA approval trial. And tell us a little bit about that, if you could. So what it's taken to get to this step, and, it takes people to believe in it. It takes money. And how have you been able to secure all of that, getting investors? And you must have quite a team, right, who's working together towards that same goal.
Yeah. So once we got the patents, I sat right down to you randomly at that dinner and talked to you. And, you were excited about it. And that we basically, you were one of the original people on our advisory board, right? So I would cold call people like Roger Dimachowski, who I've never met, but know him as the, longtime editor of Neurourology and Urodynamics, and just ask him if he'd listen to this idea and if he thought it sounded like a viable therapy and a commercially viable product that patients would like. You vetted the idea, he vetted the idea, and I would kind of get different people from different aspects of women's health or urology or even neuromodulation on our advisory committee. Then I presented at conferences outside of OBGYN, because OBGYN doesn't do this. So National Neuromodulation Society meetings, and, was talking to neurophysiologists and neurosurgeons and pain doctors and stuff, and learned a lot there and about the neuromodulation space, how little there is in GU and GI neuromodulation at those meetings. And that all just validated the idea, the market potential, and also just the wide open potential for neuromodulation therapies in both GU and GI realms. So once I was confident that we could proceed, it was like a realistic endeavor, we raised money. And like Tova said, friends and family, my business contact, co-founder, who has an entrepreneurial background in software going back 30 years, knows people that trust his judgment, and he's very careful on vetting his own things. So that's sort of how we raised our first round, to hire an engineering firm to make the first wearable wired prototype and to fund the first in human studies, and then subsequently a home trial for 72-hour wear with a wired device. After those studies proved safety, but obviously not efficacy because they're too small, we definitely had enough confidence that we'd hit an important few milestones by that point, raised more money, and were able to develop or miniaturize the device and make it self-powered, rechargeable, wearable without batteries, develop software apps for bladder diary and programming the device and uploading patient data to the cloud, and to kind of pursue the usability study, which will be small, but the big pivotal trial, which we plan to start this year. The FDA piece, that's where you had to go push through that and see if you would fail before you raised money for the trial, because if you couldn't get through the FDA in terms of what our goals were for therapy and their expectations, then there's no point to do a trial. And it took 4 visits and over a year, I would say a year and a half probably, because COVID delayed the timing of those meetings quite a bit because the FDA was occupied. We found alignment on indications and our outcome measures.
Yeah. So that's really exciting that you've gotten to this point. The FDA approval trial will be starting hopefully very soon. The device is in its relatively speaking, final form, right? And there'll be 10 sites or so across the United States that will all be doing a trial for this. Dr. Haessler, then with the FDA approval trial that's about to happen, we all hope that will be very successful, show, certainly for the FDA, show safety as well as efficacy, and be approved. So to be something that will be hopefully readily available for patients to utilize. Do you have thoughts about what your ideas are after that with this device? Is this something that then you would look to develop a team to commercialize it? Or is this something as an inventor, right, entrepreneurial, that then you look for a company to maybe take this over? Or how does that work?
I guess my goal is to have it be available to patients and a more affordable, adoptable therapy for women. And the neuromodulation implants have maybe been 300,000 in 25 years. 20 million women in America have overactive bladder. So there's just the implants aren't meeting the need of the population, and they never will. Most communities don't even have urologists that place these, for example, or any OBGYN or nurse practitioner or women's health provider or urologist that cares to focus on women's health and urology could easily just try this for a few months and see if the patient likes it or not. So I think there's just a huge opportunity, and to get at what the perfect strategy or the right strategy will be at the time to make that happen, it's not clear to me. I don't personally feel like I need to be the Martha Stewart of this or, to get it all the way through or to have it be my project necessarily, but I definitely want to see it happen. Early on, there were overtures from a big company to kind of put us in sort of a incubator box of sorts, and we ran for the hills. It was way too early, and they would have never done it. And they even told us, like, we can't do this internally. You need to, smaller focused groups do much better at developing things to a certain point. And they, hoped that we would do that and, maybe come back someday. So I'm definitely open to selling it to the right company that is capable and clearly intending to distribute it ultimately. But, it'll just have to depend. It'll depend. After coming this far from just being like a working mom in solo practice and being able to do this just by handfuls of experts in their fields and putting this together just with like people working as consultants, I mean, I believe we could do it on our own. They'll just have to see.
Yeah, time will tell. Well, these are really 3 really innovative innovative ideas. And so I hope the audience here has seen kind of that thought process behind where these ideas came from and how people were able to actualize them. I think many people have great ideas, but then they just think, well, I can't do that. But hopefully you're seeing 3 great people who have taken the ball and ran with it and given us some helpful tips about it. And so that inspires you to also move forward with your ideas. I think one thing that comes forward is that the idea that physicians, Tova, Dr. Weiss, you mentioned this, that you really provided the medical application to the idea, right? You're working with these really, really smart engineers. I know I've done some consulting work with different engineers with different companies over the time, and they're extremely smart, right, in the area of engineering, but they don't understand the medical applicability. And so as a physician, there are many places to have a seat at the table, right, that can influence what happens in our field and even for further product development. So as a trainee and as a learner, how does one find those opportunities so early on? Do you have any advice for other residents who are interested in doing things like this?
Yeah, definitely. I think partnering with the engineering school early was very helpful. I was fortunate enough that at UW we had an engineering group that I could work with, but I think as I go through training, I had a slightly fresher perspective just because I wasn't an established person in the field. And so I early on was noticing different things that was done because that was the standard of care. But with a slightly fresher perspective, I think I noticed deficiencies. And so I think early on, just kind of writing down those things that you notice, and then just kind of continuing to come back to them and think about which ones have true merit, and then talking to people who are experts in what they do. And so going to the engineers and asking for their feedback, and they would come up with a device, but maybe it would take 15 minutes and it would have to be applied by really skilled hands. And so kind of saying, well, that's not really feasible. We need a nurse to be able to apply it in less than 2 minutes. They're not going to use it if it's going to take them 10 minutes to put on. And so the constant back and forth was really crucial. And so kind of partnering with a young mind like myself, and then the experts, and kind of always going back and forth between engineers and the medical perspective was really helpful.
Yeah, that's a good point. And Jay, working with other industry partners, so you have some sense of experience with working with different industry partners. How does one become like a key opinion leader that they might actually be tapped into as a resource by different industries, so that you are able to be that person that helps with the medical applicability of, different things that these companies always have all kinds of great ideas coming down the pike, but they need people to help guide that. How does one get to be a key opinion leader and get known to be?
Steve Jobs once said innovation distinguishes between a leader and a follower. As physicians, we are looked up to as leaders in healthcare. And we need to really embrace innovation to better serve our patients in ways that were not possible before. So if we embrace that concept and go to industry when we see a problem and say, hey, there is a better solution, let's find it. I think it was Thomas Edison that says there is a way to do it better. Just find it. Not that if there is a way, but there is always a way. You just have to think beyond what you see in front of you. And once you see that, industry partners will, I think, really listen to you because they know you're the expert. You're the one that sees these patients day in and day out, and you understand their problems, their social issues, socio-economic issues. So if you just take that knowledge and present it to the partners in industry, I think you can go really far. And there are going to be failures. We talked about failure. Dr. Haessler said, you got to fail early and you got to fail sometimes often to really develop a good product or a good idea. And on the path of innovation, there's always going to be failures. Without failure, there's just no progress. I think I'm quoting too many people, but, I think it was Elon Musk recently said something about failure is an option here. If things are not failing, you're not innovating enough. I think personally as failure as bricks that we use to pave a path. If you fail enough, you will collect enough bricks to pave the path to ultimate success. And that's really what it's all about. And I really would encourage all of our colleagues to go out there. You see problems every day in your practices. These challenges that we all see in healthcare are not really roadblocks. There are invitations to innovate and to improve. And we can make a much bigger difference, I think, in patients' lives when we embrace that concept.
Dr. Haessler, so along the same lines, it's great to have these ideas and move forward and talk to industry, but here, starting your own company to move it forward, building your team, making sure you had control of the steps along the way. Can you give people some advice about if they want to take it to that level? And what does it really take to do that? Because, it's great to have ideas, but how do we actually then see it through?
I think you really have to ally with at least one person in the beginning that has a different knowledge base than you do, who you trust. When I was vetting this idea to a Silicon Valley friend who is an electrical engineer and also is in startups for 30 years, I said, how can I just do this? I just know about gynecology and I don't know about engineering. I don't even know about neuromodulation science. I know nothing about business. I don't know anything about clinical trials. I just wanted to be a surgeon. And he says, don't worry about that at all. It takes two people to make any great company, one in the space, and one that knows about business, right? And so he used Jobs and Wozniak as examples and Hewlett and Packard as examples. And it all seems sort of silly to me that we're talking about those people in my context. But it ended up working out in that way that my co-founder, business partner, when I as a surgeon am scared to take a step that's going to be because we think of danger, right? That's going to be a bad outcome to us that someone's injured or I made a mistake or something bad. But the innovation people, it's just how they roll. It's like somebody running a marathon and they trip and they just get up and keep running. And so I've learned to follow their lead on risk in all these scenarios. Surgeons are used to being the one that decides everything in their realm, in their theater. But I've learned to defer anything that just doesn't sound just totally wrong to me to the business side. I've learned to just trust them. Even in the grade schools here, and I don't know if it's a Bay Area or if it's a whole new thing, but my kids they're teaching an inventor's mindset for life in second and third grade. And one of it's that when you fail, like you're saying, Dr. Shakuri-Rad, it's the opportunity for improvement, but they say it's just a little adjustment. It's just a little tweak you need to make. There's not a negative implication to it. And the startup people, that's how they roll. And I like it.
Yeah. Well, that's fun. I know it's been really fun to be part of that. So, well, thank you to all our guests. We're really excited for this podcast today. So thank you for Dr. Tova Weiss from the University of Washington, Dr. J. Shakuri-Rad, and Dr. Allie Haessler for sharing your vast experience and expertise with us today about this subject. We're truly thankful for your contributions in our field here and for taking the interest and finding the gaps and investing your own time and your own effort into effectively filling those gaps and making our field even better. So thank you. Kudos to each one of you for your success, and thank you.
Thank you, Suzette.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe, rate the podcast 5 stars, and share with a friend.
If you have any questions or comments, DM us at _BackTable on Instagram, LinkedIn, or Twitter.
BackTable is hosted by Aditya Bagrodia
And Jose Silva.
Our audio team is led by Kieran Gannon, with support from
Josh McWhirter,
Aaron Bowles,
Josh Spencer.
Design and digital marketing led by Brian Schmitz.
Social media and PR by Chi Ding.
Administrative support provided by Jamila Kennebrew.
Thanks again for listening, and see you next week.